When we hear the First World War, our minds immediately go to the trenches of the 20th century, right? But what if I told you that the real First World War, the one that set the stage for all the others, wasn't fought with tanks and planes, but in a dusty desert valley, thousands of years ago? We're about to dive into an ancient story that, believe it or not, might have a whole lot to say about our world today. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in Genesis, chapter 14, and what you have here is a huge regional war. On one side, there's this powerful alliance of four kings led by a guy named Amraphel, the king of Babylonia. And on the other side, five local Canaanite kings, including the rulers of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, for 12 long years, these five kings were basically paying tribute. But in year 13, they decided they'd had enough. They rebelled. And that's what kicks off this huge battle in the Valley of Siddim. And right here, this is where our source material drops a pretty radical idea. It suggests that this ancient battle wasn't really about territory or unpaid taxes. No, this was the first time a much, much deeper conflict spilled out into the physical world. It was the opening shot in a spiritual war between two opposing ways of thinking, a war that, according to this view, is still being fought right now. So what are these two clashing forces? Well, the source breaks it down for us. It's not about nations or armies, fundamentally. It's about two competing spirits that drive humanity. They're like two completely different operating systems for the world, and they've been in conflict from the very beginning. This slide really lays it all out. On the left, you've got the spirit of Babylon, and it's embodied by King Amraphel. Our source points to him as history's first imperialist, someone driven by this relentless need for conquest, fueled by greed and rebellion against any higher authority. Then, on the right, you have the spirit of Abraham, who actually gets dragged into this mess to rescue his nephew. He represents something totally different, a spirit of peace, of faith, generosity, and a deep sense of gratitude. Okay, so if this spiritual conflict is still happening, what's its engine? What keeps that spirit of conquest and greed going, generation after generation? The source material we're looking at says the answer isn't in some complicated historical analysis. It's actually spelled out in a single, really insightful passage from the New Testament. And there it is. The book of James just asks this very direct question. Where do wars come from? And the answer it gives is pretty stunning. It says all those external wars, all the fighting between nations, they're just a symptom of the wars going on inside of us. It's our own selfish desires, that constant inner battle. You want something you don't have, so you scheme, you fight, and you're willing to do just about anything to get it. So the whole thing really boils down to this one powerful word, covetousness. And this isn't just about wanting a new car. No, this is a deep, burning desire for what isn't yours, be it power, status, or stuff. Our source identifies this very feeling as the fuel for that spirit of Babylon. It's a mindset that says, I can take whatever I want. And in doing so, it basically challenges the entire idea of a divine, orderly universe. Now, once you have this framework in your head, this idea of two warring spirits, the source suggests you can start to see this same battle play out over and over again throughout history. These big moments we read about, they aren't just random events. They're like different rounds in one long, epic fight. And this timeline here gives us a few snapshots. You see that spirit of self-glorification at the Tower of Babel, right? That was all about humanity making a name for itself. Then it pops up again in a more personal way with Goliath, this giant whose arrogance is basically a challenge to everything Israel stands for. The source then points to the crucifixion as the absolute peak of the conflict, a moment where it looked like the spirit of Babylon had won for good, but was actually its greatest defeat. And finally, it all points toward a future, prophesied knockout, where this cosmic war finally comes to an end. But let's get back to our original story. So, Abraham pulls off this miraculous victory, defeats these invading kings, and rescues everyone. But the story's not over. On his way home, he's confronted. And this, right here, is the real climax. He meets two different kings, and each one offers him a choice. It's a test to see where his loyalty, his allegiance truly lies. So first, he runs into Melchizedek. This guy is one of the most mysterious figures in the entire Bible. He's the king of Salem, what would become Jerusalem, and he's called a priest of God Most High. He just appears out of nowhere. And what does he offer? Not power, not riches. He offers bread, wine, and a blessing. And listen to his words. He gives all the credit for the victory to God, reminding Abraham where his true strength comes from. That's path number one. And then the second king shows up. It's the king of Sodom, the very city Abraham just saved. And his offer is the total opposite of Melchizedek's. He basically says, look, keep all the stuff, all the plunder from the war. It's yours. Just give me the people. Give me the souls. Our source reads this as the classic worldly temptation: take all the riches you want in exchange for influence and control over people's lives. In Abraham's response, it is absolutely decisive. He completely shuts down the king of Sodom. He swears an oath right then and there that he won't take a thing, not even a shoelace, so that no human being could ever say, I'm the one who made Abraham rich. He's drawing a very clear line in the sand, publicly declaring that his provider is God, not the kings of this world. So after all that drama, what's the point? What are we supposed to take away from this? Well, that moment after the battle with those two kings boils this entire cosmic war down to one single fundamental choice. It's a choice that the source argues every single one of us and every society still has to make today. And wow, this slide just says it all, doesn't it? The choice is between two completely different ways to live. You have the way of the king of Sodom, the spirit of the world, which is to love things and use people to get those things. But then you have Abraham's way, the way aligned with Melchizedek, which is to use things, but to love people. It's such a simple distinction, but it's absolutely profound, and it defines everything. So in the end, this story about a forgotten war from almost 4,000 years ago isn't really about the past. It's a mirror. It's suggesting that the very same spiritual forces are at work today, driven by the very same desires inside all of us. And so it leaves us with a question that echoes all the way from that ancient valley to our modern world. In all the conflicts we face, big and small, which spirit are we going to follow? Which way will we choose?
You know, if you look at almost any great wisdom tradition, they all have a similar idea of what a successful life looks like.
Right. It's not about just accumulating stuff.
No, not at all.
Right.
It's about this deep, unshakable stability. There's this image of a person who's like a tree planted by streams of water. They're prosperous, fruitful, just fundamentally secure.
And that image of being deeply rooted is exactly what we need for today's deep dive. We are jumping into a really old, really complex source, Genesis chapter 14.
A chapter a lot of people might skip over.
They do. Commentators often call this the First World War. But we're not just here for, a history lesson.
Okay.
We're looking at this text as a kind of prophetic blueprint.
Yeah.
The mission here is to figure out how this one ancient conflict lays out the spiritual causes, the characters, and the ultimate outcome of all human conflict.
So if we can understand this one story, we get a shortcut to understanding why wars happen in the first place. And the sources suggest it's not politics, it's not economics.
No, it's deeper.
It's covetousness and ingratitude. And right in the middle of it all is Abraham, not just as a patriarch, but as a surprisingly effective military commander.
Okay, so let's set the scene for this so-called First World War. Where are we?
We're in the region of the Dead Sea in a place called the Valley of Siddim. And this is a clash of, well, regional superpower.
So we have two sides.
Exactly. You've got a powerful northern coalition of 4 kings. Their leader is a guy named Chedorlaomer of Elam, and they're fighting a smaller alliance of 5 rebel kings from the south.
Including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, which are names most people will recognize.
Right. And what's really fascinating is the motive here. This wasn't a surprise attack. The 5 southern kings had been subjects, vassals of Chedorlaomer for 12 years.
12 years of paying tribute.
Yep. And in the 13th year, they just rebelled. They'd had enough.
Yeah.
So Chedorlaomer and his allies, Amraphel of Babylon is another big one, they saw this as a major challenge to their authority.
So this response wasn't just about collecting late taxes. This was a massive show of force. Oh, absolutely. It was a systematic campaign to crush all dissent in the region. The source actually details this brutal march before they even get to the main battle.
Really? What did they do?
Chedorlaomer's forces just swept down through modern-day Jordan and Syria, defeating group after group. The Rephites, the Zuzites, the Emim, they went all the way down to the edge of the desert.
Just dominating everyone in their path.
Total dominance. Then they turned back to deal with the main rebels, and when that final battle happens in the Valley of the Dead Sea, it ends spectacularly badly for the southern kings.
And the text gives this weird geographical reason for it, right? Something about the valley itself?
Yeah, the Valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits.
So like natural tar pits.
Exactly, natural asphalt pools.
Yeah.
So when the armies of Sodom and Gomorrah panicked and tried to flee, many of their soldiers literally fell into these sticky, treacherous pits.
What a way to lose a battle.
A complete rout.
Yeah.
The rest escaped to the mountains. And the invaders, completely victorious, immediately ransacked Sodom and Gomorrah. They took everything: goods, food, and people.
And among this people was Lot, Abraham's nephew. He had, maybe unwisely, chosen to live right near Sodom.
And he paid the price for that choice.
So now the story completely shifts focus. It pivots to Abraham.
It does. A survivor, an escapee, makes it to Abraham, who's living peacefully near an oak grove.
And the text calls him Abraham the Hebrew. He wasn't totally isolated, though. He had allies.
Right, local chieftains named Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner. They were his allies. But the force he puts together to respond, that's all his own.
This is the part that always gets me. He mobilizes 318 trained men.
And notice the detail. Born in his house. This isn't a militia, he called it.
No, this is his own private, loyal, highly trained security force. It's a small number compared to the army he's about to face, but they're clearly an elite unit.
Deeply loyal. So what's his strategy? He's pursuing this massive victorious army that just crushed 5 kings.
It seems like a suicide mission.
It should be. But his strategy is all about speed and surprise. He pursues them north, all the way to a place called Dan, and he knows he can't win in a straight-up fight.
So he attacks at night.
He divides his small force
Yeah.
and launches a surprise attack in the dead of night. It completely disorients them. He then chases the defeated army relentlessly, all the way north of Damascus.
And the victory is total. He gets everything back. The goods, the people, his nephew Lot, all of it.
Every last bit.
So this brings us to the big ethical question, doesn't it? When is war actually justified? The text seems to hold this up as a perfect example.
It really does. Abraham's action is framed as the model for a just war. His motive wasn't conquest or greed. It was purely defensive and redemptive.
He's saving his family, saving innocent people.
Exactly. He was fighting against what the source calls codicia, this grasping, insatiable covetousness, this desire to possess what really only belongs to the Creator.
Okay, so this is where we get into the prophetic significance of the story, why it's more than just an old war story.
Right. Discovery number 1 is figuring out who the enemy really is, symbolically. The text names Amraphel, king of Babylon, as one of the leaders.
And commentators connect him to other figures, don't they?
They do. Jewish tradition especially identifies him with Nimrod, the great rebel who tried to build the Tower of Babel. Some even connect him to Hammurabi.
The famous lawgiver.
Yes. The idea is he represents a system of human-centric power and law trying to replace divine justice. He's not just a king. He's the spirit of conquest, the spirit of Babylon.
So this isn't just a local war. It's a template for the ultimate conflict.
That's the idea. The spirit of conquest and greed, which is Babylon, versus the spirit of peace and generosity, which is represented by Abraham's descendants.
Wow. Okay, so after this huge victory, Abraham has 2 really critical meetings with 2 different kings.
And these meetings define everything. The first is with a man named Melchizedek.
King of Salem, ancient Jerusalem, and priest of the Most High God. A very mysterious figure.
One of the most mysterious figures in the whole text. He doesn't come out with a sword. He comes out with bread and wine, provision and blessing.
Yeah.
And he blesses Abraham, but he makes it very clear who gets the credit.
He says God delivered the enemies into Abraham's hand.
Right. He transfers all the glory from the human warrior to the divine source. It's a crucial recentering.
And Abraham's response is just as important. He gives Melchizedek a tenth, a tithe of everything he recovered. This is the first time we see this in the source material. What is that act really about?
It's an act of practical gratitude. By giving 10% back, Abraham is publicly declaring, I know where this came from. I know I'm not the ultimate owner of any of this. It's the polar opposite of covetousness.
Okay, so immediately after that profound moment, he meets the second king.
The king of Sodom. And this encounter is pure spiritual theater.
What does he offer?
He says to Abraham, give me the people, but you can keep all the goods.
And the commentators see this as a temptation.
A classic temptation. The king of Sodom is seen as an analogy for the ultimate tempter. He's saying, I'll let you have all the worldly riches, just give me the souls.
And Abraham's response is one of the most powerful moments in the whole story.
It is. He swears an oath to God. He says he will not take anything, not even a thread or a sandal strap. So the king of Sodom can never say, I am the one who made Abraham rich.
He only takes food for his men and a share for his allies.
That's it. And this is the moral lesson that Lot completely missed. The world offers pleasure, possessions, pride. Lot coveted that and lost everything.
There's a great summary of this in the sources. The world loves things and uses people.
But Abraham used things and loved people. His refusal to take the spoils was his real victory. So if we zoom out from this one story, The source material is pretty explicit that the real fight isn't against, well, against other people.
Not against flesh and blood.
Right.
Yeah.
The Apostle Paul says we're fighting against spiritual powers, against the authorities of this invisible dark world. Genesis 14 is just a physical symptom of that deeper conflict.
So if the battle is spiritual, what's the mechanism that makes it break out in the physical world over and over again?
Well, the book of James really nails this. It says all wars, personal, global, whatever, they come from the evil desires battling inside us. Coveting, envy.
Asking God for things with the wrong motives, just to spend it on our own pleasure.
It's an internal war that spills outward. And the solution isn't to fight harder, but to trust more. If you have absolute confidence that the Creator knows what He's doing with His resources, you stop coveting what He gave your neighbor.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so let's trace this spiritual war. The source material lays out something like 12 crucial rounds in this fight, from creation to the very end.
Okay, round one is right at the beginning. The earth became formless and empty, chaos. Something disrupted the initial perfection.
Round 2, the weapon is deception. The serpent questions God's word, introducing doubt.
Round 3 is corruption, the era of the sons of God and the Nephilim. The goal was to corrupt the entire human line with wickedness.
Round 4, collective arrogance, the Tower of Babel. Let's make a name for ourselves. It's a direct defiance of God's plan.
Round 5 is the one we just discussed, Genesis 14, the First World War, where that internal greed takes on a physical imperial form.
Round 6, the Red Sea crossing. God intervenes directly, causing mass confusion among the Egyptian army. The lesson is, God fights for those who trust him.
Round 7 is critical, the war against Amalek. The Amalekites attacked the weakest of the Israelites in the desert, showing zero gratitude or reverence for their miraculous deliverance. Amalek becomes the symbol of human ingratitude.
Okay, round 8, Jericho. The walls fall down not because of military might, but because of shouting and horns, obedience over strength.
Round 9, David and Goliath. David, the grateful worshiper, humbles Goliath, the symbol of pride and defiance. It's like Psalm 2 says, the nations rage, but the Lord just laughs at them.
Round 10 is the great turning point, Yeshua's death. When he says, "It is finished," the powers of this world think they've won.
But they fail to realize his death was actually their ultimate defeat. It secured salvation.
Round 11. This is the model for us now, isn't it?
It is. The early church. Regular people, speaking with incredible boldness, winning not by force, but by love, by sharing everything, and by refusing to take vengeance.
And the final round, the knockout. Round 12.
That's the final victory, the establishment of the New Jerusalem, where all tears, pain, and death are wiped away. A world finally free from greed, pride, and ingratitude.
That is an incredible arc, tracing this one core conflict of greed versus gratitude all the way through history. So to summarize for everyone listening, the root cause of all unjust wars isn't land or politics, but ingratitude. It's the desire to possess what belongs only to the Creator.
And so the key to our own stability, our own prosperity, isn't getting more, but having this quiet, absolute confidence in divine wisdom and ownership.
Which leads to the practical takeaway. How do we win this war in our own lives?
We win it for our souls and for our families by following the example of Abraham and the early church with active love, by sharing what we have, and by completely refusing the temptations of vengeance or worldly gain.
You defeat the spirit of war by adopting the spirit of peace.
Exactly.
This whole deep dive really boils down to that choice Abraham faced after the battle. The choice between the spirit of Abraham and Yeshua, which is gratitude and selflessness, and the spirit of the king of Sodom and Amraphel, which is greed and pride.
And the source material promises that this attitude of total gratitude is what finally wins the last war.
So we'll leave you with a final thought to chew on. Knowing that this ultimate battle isn't really against other people, but against those destructive desires inside of us, which spirit are you adopting in your daily decisions? The spirit of acquisition and pride, or the spirit of selflessness and total gratitude? Because the answer to that question determines everything about your own personal peace.